The courtroom was wrapped in an unbearable silence, a silence that didn't soothe but suffocated, thick and oppressive like a storm cloud pressing down on every soul in the room. It wasn't the kind of quiet that brought peace, but the kind that stifled breath, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths and impending judgment. Every pair of eyes remained locked forward, bodies rigid with tension, as if the very walls were bracing for what was to come. At the defendant's table, Ethan Brooks sat motionless. His fingers curled so tightly into fists that his knuckles had turned an unnatural shade of white. His pulse pounded violently in his ears, but his expression remained carefully composed, a mask of forced calm that he had mastered long ago. He knew that, as a black man in a courtroom, emotions could be misconstrued, twisted, and turned against him in an instant. A single glance mistaken for defiance, a flicker of frustration misread as aggression. It was a dangerous game, one he had no choice but to play. Across from him, Officer Ryan Callahan sat perched on the witness stand. His police uniform meticulously pressed, his badge gleaming like a medal of honor beneath the bright courtroom lights. To the untrained eye, he looked every bit the upstanding officer, a man of duty and law. But beneath that polished surface was something far more sinister, a web of carefully spun lies, unraveling with each breath he took. "I saw the defendant flee the scene," Callahan stated with conviction, his voice unwavering, steady as a man with nothing to hide. "He was aggressive, resisted arrest. We found stolen goods in his vehicle." Every single word. From behind Ethan, the brittle silence was suddenly pierced by a quiet, choked sob. His mother, Martha Brooks, sat just a few feet away, her entire body trembling as she struggled to hold herself together. She had been there through every second of this trial, gripping onto hope while each fabricated accusation chipped away at her heart. She knew her son wasn't perfect. What mother would claim their child was? But she also knew this much: Ethan wasn't a criminal. She had raised him to be respectful, to stay out of trouble, to tread carefully in a world that often viewed his very existence as a threat. And yet, despite everything she had done to prepare him, despite all the lessons of survival she had instilled in him, here they were. His fate hung by a thread, his freedom teetering on the edge, all because one man had decided that his truth didn't matter. The prosecutor barely lifted a finger to challenge Callahan's claims. His questions were routine, predictable, the same tired script used for so many black defendants before Ethan. This was just another case. Another rubber-stamped guilty verdict waiting to be signed. But Naomi Ellis, Ethan's lawyer, wasn't about to let that happen. She rose slowly from her seat, the click of her heels against the polished marble floor echoing through the courtroom like the ticking of a countdown. She moved with purpose, every step deliberate, every motion controlled, though the fire in her eyes burned dangerously close to the surface. "Officer Callahan." Naomi's voice was smooth, composed, yet laced with an edge so sharp it could cut glass. "Are you absolutely certain about what you saw that night?" Callahan exhaled through his nose, a ghost of a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "I wouldn't be under oath if I wasn't, ma'am." Ethan remained still, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. His frustration burned like an ember just beneath his skin. He knew the truth. He had proof. But what did that matter in a system that wasn't built to believe men like him? A system that, time and time again, had placed its trust in men like Callahan. Naomi stepped forward, the tension in the room tightening with each click of her heels against the floor. "You stated that my client resisted arrest," she continued, her tone unwavering. "Did your body camera capture this alleged resistance?" Flicker. Hesitation. A crack forming in the perfect armor Callahan had built around himself. "It was malfunctioning," he answered at last, his voice losing just a fraction of its earlier confidence. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Ethan shut his eyes, inhaling deeply. Of course, the body cam had failed at the most critical moment. Coincidence. Pattern. But Naomi wasn't finished. "Well," she said, carefully sliding a document onto the evidence table, Her gaze locked onto Callahan like a predator closing in. "It seems you weren't the only officer on duty that night." Callahan's jaw tightened. A bead of sweat formed along his temple. "We obtained footage from Officer Marcus Reynolds' body cam." Naomi's voice grew sharper, her words slicing through the thick courtroom air like a blade. "Funny thing is, his camera worked just fine." The murmurs turned into a wave of hushed exclamations. From behind Ethan, his mother let out an audible gasp, her hands clenching the arms of her seat. She had spent her entire life preparing her son for moments like this. For injustice, for survival. But never, not once, had she dared to hope for a moment like this. A moment where the truth might actually break through. Callahan stiffened. His face paled. "Would you like me to play the footage, Officer Callahan?" Naomi asked sweetly, her voice honeyed but sharp enough to draw blood. The judge, who had spent most of the trial scribbling notes in disinterest, suddenly looked up, his curiosity piqued. "I don't see how that's necessary," Callahan attempted, but Naomi had already given the technician a nod. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears as the grainy footage began to play. Quiet neighborhood. Flickering street lamps. The timestamp in the corner perfectly matched the night of his arrest. Then Callahan's unmistakable voice. "That's him. Black hoodie. Hands in his pockets. Looks suspicious as hell." Ethan winced. He remembered that night. He had been walking home from a friend's place, earbuds in, head down, mind occupied with thoughts of a work project due the next day. Then another voice, Officer Reynolds, came through the speakers. "Ryan, slow down. The guy's just walking." But Callahan cut him off. "They always act innocent. Watch this." A sharp gasp echoed through the room. Even the judge's expression hardened. On the footage, Ethan turned, startled by the sudden approach of the patrol car. His mouth opened, ready to ask what was going on, but before he could get a word out, Callahan shoved him, slamming him against the car. Ethan's groan of pain filled the courtroom. And then the final blow. Callahan leaned in close. His voice caught perfectly by the mic on Reynolds' vest. "You move an inch, boy, and I'll make sure you don't walk away from this." The courtroom erupted. Someone cursed from the back. Martha Brooks covered her mouth, tears spilling freely now, her body trembling from the sheer force of relief and rage. Callahan's face had gone ghostly pale. Naomi let the video play a moment longer before cutting the feed. She turned to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice slicing through the chaos, "the prosecution's entire case is built on the testimony of an officer who not only lied under oath but used threats and excessive force against an innocent man." She turned back to Callahan, whose hands were now visibly shaking. "Tell me, Officer Callahan, do you still stand by your statement?"